Hello everyone and welcome to Smart Code. In this video, you are going to learn CSS specificity and how it works and calculate it. While working with the CSS, there are times when you write several different selectors pointing to a particular element. So in this case, when several selectors pointing to a particular element and they may contain conflicting rules, your browser needs to figure out which rule to apply. And browser does it by calculating the CSS specificity value for each selector. And the selector that has the highest specificity value is finally chosen and applied, right? So understanding the term specificity is very important, and honestly speaking, if you don't really know how specificity works, you are going to blame CSS on a number of reasons, like it's difficult and styles do not always work. On the other hand, if you know how specificity works and calculate it, you actually know your style sheet better and can write selectors with higher specificity. Right, so let's start this tutorial. So first I'm going to present the code where I'm using several different selectors targeting the same element. We will study the code and then jump into the specificity calculation. Now look at the HTML file. I have a paragraph and applied a class and an ID to it. And inside the paragraph, I have a span tag, and a span tag also has a class and ID applied to it. Now our CSS file is very interesting. Here you see 8 different selectors, and the interesting thing is that all of them targeting only the span tag and trying to set a different font color. So what you see here is a massive style collision. It's like a war between the selectors. Another interesting thing is that our browser is gonna select only one selector, and the winning selector in the list is the last one because this selector has the highest specificity than the others in the list. And here in the browser you can see the result, right? And the second highest specificity is held by the selector that is marked on the screen. And as I comment out the last style, your browser gonna select this one. And here you just see the evidence, right? So when I wrote these selectors, I calculated their specificity values simultaneously in my head. And I knew exactly which style holds the highest specificity and gonna select by the browser. So what I wanna convey here is once you know how specificity is calculated, then you can use this knowledge to write more specific styles, right? So let's now move ahead and look how do we perform specificity calculation. In order to keep specificity calculation simple, we assign constant specificity values to type, class, and ID selector. And the system looks as presented in the table on the screen. A type or tag selector is worth 1 point specificity. A class selector is worth 10 points, and an ID selector is worth 100 points. So just keep these values in mind. ID selector value is greater than class selector, and class selector value is greater than type selector, right? So let's now, using this table, calculate the specificity value of all the selectors that we have in our CSS file. Our first selector in the list is type selector, and according to the table, its specificity value is 1, right? And second selector is a descendant selector composed of 2 type selectors. And each type selector has a specificity value of 1. So the total specificity value becomes 2. And the third selector composed of a class and a type selector. So the class selector has a value of 10 and type selector has a value of 1. So the total specificity becomes 11. And the specificity for the fourth selector is 20 as we have 2 class selectors. And now the fifth selector consists of 2 IDs and a type selector. So adding their values give us a total of 201. In selectors number 6 and 7 has a specificity of 100 and 101 respectively. And finally, the last selector is the heaviest selector in terms of specificity. It consists of two IDs and a class selector. And after adding the values of IDs and class, you will get a total of 210. So the 210 is the greatest specificity value that we have in our style sheet. And that's why it has been chosen by the browser, right? As you see now, the specificity calculation is not so difficult, right? But it gives you a powerful knowledge to determine which rule is going to pick by the browser. In addition, you can even use specificity to construct selectors with higher specificity values, right? So we are not done with this topic yet, and I hope you are not tired of listening me. So there are some specificity rules that you also need to remember, and we are going to look into them one by one. And the rule number 1 is if you have inline CSS added to an element, then it will always win and override any style in the external style sheet. Like here in the example, this ID selector won't be applied. The inline CSS will be applied and the color of the paragraph will be green, right? And the rule number 2 is if you have two or more same selectors with no conflicting properties, then your browser gonna select both of them. Like here in the example, both the selectors are the same but containing different properties. So there is no conflict between the properties. In this case, your browser going to select both of them. And here we have another variation. Let's say if there is another rule with higher specificity, such as the third rule in our file, and targeting the same element, and there is no property conflict, then the browser is going to apply all of them. So one thing is quite obvious here. The CSS specificity is only important when multiple selectors affect the same element and containing conflicting properties, right? If there is no conflicting properties, you can skip thinking about the specificity. Okay, so here comes the rule number 3, and it's about conflicting properties. If there are two or more same selectors with conflicting properties, like you see in the example, then the selector appearing last in the style sheet wins. But here we also have a variation in rule number 3. And the variation is, let's say I shift a selector from external style to internal style. Now one belongs to the internal sheet and the other one belongs to the external. In addition, they are exactly the same selectors and containing conflicting rule. So in this case, the placement of style sheet within HTML becomes very important. Like here, the external style sheet is attached after the style tag. So the style from the external style sheet wins. But if internal sheet comes after, then the style from the internal sheet wins, right? And now the rule number 4 and the final rule is the universal selector on its own has no specificity. Like the specificity of the first selector is 0 and the second selector has a value of 2 because of two type selectors. So the universal selectors do not contribute to specificity. And the pseudo classes that we use to style anchor tags like hover have same specificity values as class selectors. And so just like universal selectors, the combinator characters that we use to create child and sibling selectors have no specificity. Right, so that was all about the CSS specificity, and I hope you learned something from this video. So it's the time to say goodbye. I will see you around, and thanks for watching.